This is going to be preparing for a simul against a grandmaster who actually plays the spike. And we're going to run a couple engines against this and look at them both. This is a 22 move spike that the grandmaster plays. And both engines suggest d5 as the proper response. Now, engines are suspect in a lot of ways. It's saying, for instance, knight to c6 is just as good. This engine's sticking with d5. This is a strong tactical engine, so I would kind of stick with that. So now let's see what gets played. e5, okay. And as we say, e5 has the same result. It's even a better evaluation once it gets played. So how does a person play the spike? Do they play bishop to g2 and follow up with c4 and stuff like that? That's what the engine's recommending, and the engine is also recommending that here. So let's continue on. Bishop to g2. It's crying for d5, d5, d5. Okay, so this is not something that gets played in this game, as I recall. Interestingly, this engine wants h5. And that's an idea I actually embrace. I think the idea of h5 is wonderful, simply because it addresses the spike where the spike is weak. Now we're going to open the h file. So this is an interesting move, an interesting attempt to cover the d5 square and avoid a push on a knight that's on f6. And according to the engine, it's still okay. And now c4 gets played, and the engine says d5, d5 again. We can, as long as we can play d5, we're okay. For one thing, we're opening up a bishop on the g4 pawn. So at some point, that becomes a nuisance. So as we see, we're maintaining an advantage, not a great one. Now it's suggesting d6. d6 is played. And now h3 for white, and that doesn't get played. Instead, the push happens. So that's kind of interesting, because the push now represents a whole nother situation, because as soon as white moves his d pawn, that pawn's covered. And so attempts to really attack that pawn are pretty fruitless, since it can also be covered by h4. So what do we do here? Well, the engine says bishop to e6, covering the d5 square again, and no doubt trying to push. And that's what gets played. And by the way, this grandmaster is playing a 2400 plus in this game. That's over the board at elo and long chess. Okay, so now it's saying knight to f5, knight to f5, knight to d4, establishing something. Knight to d4, e3. Okay, that's interesting. Hopping around in the middle. So let's see what the other engine says. Knight to d4, knight to d4, e3, then knight on d to f5, and a number of exchanges, giving him the bishop pawn. Bishop takes b7, rook to b8, bishop to g2, bishop takes c4. So the idea is to hop around, eventually get the c4 pawn in exchange for your b2 pawn. And looks like as things go along, black gets a small advantage. It doesn't seem like it's worth very much. So let's see what happens. I'd say this is preparing to castle queenside, and I'd say castling queenside here is actually a good idea. h4, now h6. Okay, so this computer wants castling queenside, this computer wants castling h6. So the first computer wants you to castle queenside, move your king to b8, and prepare that way. And this computer says directly address it. Go for h6, recapture with the rook. Now it says recapture with the rook again. So once again, you're giving him a nice later rook pawn, pawn islands. Why not? Okay, I like moving the h pawn against this. This is not the greatest move. This gives up all the advantage. It's trying to chase him out of there with c6. Now d4 gets played. c6 gets played. No exchange is offered. Pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn. And as most of games happen, there's kind of a sense of judgment going on here, especially with grandmasters against 2400s. How do they beat 2400s? Usually it's some sort of grotesque error. So white has a small advantage, and if he plays h6 here and recaptures, he's all right. That's a very difficult move to try to play. That's a very tempting move to go after his queen. However, his knight is really not that well placed there. It's getting in the way of his bishop and in the way of his e-pawn. So you're allowing him to exchange off his knight and free himself up somewhat and get this move in, e4, which now is a solid advantage for white. White has gone from, in the very beginning, down 3/4 of a pawn to now being up 3/4 of a pawn. Engine suggesting c5 here. This engine suggesting simply bishop to e6. That's what I would play. c5 gives yourself really a fatal weakness. So this is, in my opinion, the correct move. Knight to e2, c5. Now we have a backwards pawn on an open file, and you have very limited ability to defend this. There are all kinds of levers available to attack it. So knight, queen to c3, and now instead of b5, which was recommended, now we get bishop to e. Instead of e3, it goes there. Interesting. So now we have all kinds of plays against the c-pawn, and we have the potential for a whole lot of shenanigans going on. Queenside castling is nearly forced here. White castle queenside, which is interesting. Now instead of bishop to e7, this player decided to line up his queen with the opposing bishop on f4. And usually that's not the greatest idea in the world. And it's hard to recommend a lot of other things because he was pinned on the d file, which was equally dangerous. So now black's in dire straits and needs to do something. If he moves his king to b8, it's the same problem with that bishop on f4. The recommendation by the computer is sit back, as I do in the England gambit, and defend a hideous position like rook to b8. That way you'd free up your bishop. Now, interestingly, it says bishop to e3 is a recommended move, which I don't think I played in this game. Once again, h6. It's begged for h6 a number of times, and now what you see is a fatal blunder. So, did this really lose the game, this move? Analyze why this move lost the game, okay? Both sides are standing decently. One's half a pawn up. h6 attempts to attack the g-pawn and neutralize the h-file. So what is the purpose of this? Let's see. The purpose of this is to weaken the e6 square. So now, while the bishop on e6 was formerly nice and protected, it is now loose. And since it's loose, unfortunately, it's on the same diagonal as the king, so when you move it, you're going to get checked, and you're going to get a knight coming down, into your territory here. There's a natural fork on e6 already, if a knight ever lands there. So let's see what happens. Okay. Now bishop to g8 is required. Okay. Why? Okay. Bishop to g8 says he should move knight to h5. He still has 1.5 advantage and he's pressing, but you can respond h6 again. So now the bishop's loose and he gets the check, and then the bishop to e6. And now the bishop's not protected, so that there's an issue. So that now if you protect the bishop, a capture happens, and then the knight hops to e6. So what's left? How do you defend against this? Not a lot. Not a lot left here. Now that moves a flat-out blunder because it runs into knight to d5 and crushing loss. Obviously, the only place for the queen to go is to a5, and now the knight on c6 is overloaded. So this game ended in a blunder. So the two things to take away from the spike are play d5 early, first if necessary. Continue to work for d5 for equality, establishing things in the center, even if it's into the teeth of his bishop on g2 and his knight on c3 and his pawn on c4. And play h6 or h5 at the appropriate moment to try to get rid and neutralize of that g-pawn. And that seems to be the solution. So hopefully this was a helpful video and my student will benefit by it.